Hello everyone, welcome to CSCN 1001, Computer and Network Security. This is Dr. Amr Al-Mouki. In this lecture, we are going to continue the discussion on user authentication. In the last lecture on user authentication, we had seen basically an introduction. How do we verify the identity of the user, the different ways of doing user authentication, and we discussed also some classical user authentication techniques, in particular the Needham-Schroeder protocol and some of its variants. We discussed some of its weaknesses and how they can be overcome, and then we proceeded to discuss some of the ways that we do user authentication today. In particular, our focus was how do we authenticate the server, basically, when a client wants to contact the server, how do you authenticate the server? And the idea was to use something called a security certificate, which includes information that would validate the identity of that server, the URL, for example, and bind this identity to their public key. Okay, and the certificate is generated by a certificate authority, which is considered a trusted party by the clients. Okay, so in this lecture, we are going to focus on the other side of the authentication problem, which is authenticating the client. So now that we can authenticate the server using the certificate, and this is the most widely used method, we will now discuss how we can actually authenticate the client. We discussed this in the previous lecture, that in order to have a user authentication system, it goes into two main phases, a configuration phase and an operation phase. The configuration phase is basically for the registration. The client will register their credentials in the system, and in the operation phase, they will present again their credentials, whether they are biometrics or passwords or tokens or whatever, and the system will verify that this identity is a registered one. Okay, and we have seen the different ways to do or to have user credentials. Basically, something that is knowledge based or something that the user knows, such as passwords, something that the user has, such as tokens, for example, or access cards, something that the user is or does. This is the area of biometrics. We have physiological biometrics, such as the static biometrics, the fingerprints, the retinal scan, facial features, for example. And then you have behavior or dynamic biometrics, which is something that the user does, such as voice recognition, such as the hand signature, gestures, gait, for example, the way a person walks. All of these are methods of dynamic biometrics that have been explored in literature. Some systems will actually rely on more than one of these credentials, what is called multi-factor authentication. The well-known case of it is the two-factor authentication that many of us, I'm sure, are familiar with, which is, for example, that you authenticate using something that is sent to your email, for example. Okay, so we'll discuss the first such method, which is something that the user knows, and this is the most prevalent user authentication method out there, in particular using the password. Okay, and so the password is something that the user chooses or is assigned. Okay? And we all have seen, as I'm sure, we all have seen systems that impose certain restrictions as to what the password should be. For example, they tell you that it should be a minimum number of characters, it must have special characters, uppercase and lowercase letters, a numeric value, and all of those combinations in order to make sure that the password is strong. And some systems even would consider assigning you a password. And whenever you see a system that is assigning you a password, typically this password would be very complicated. A long, complicated password that consists of special characters and numbers and values, and it's not something that you can easily memorize. Even though this might seem that you have a very secure password that is difficult to guess or to brute force, it's actually quite often has proven to be a bad idea, because when a user gets a password that they have difficulty memorizing, what they will typically do is that they will write it down. And then the password doesn't become that phrase that is difficult to memorize. The password is basically where it is written. Okay, because if someone gains access to that piece of paper or that file that you have written in the password on your system, then they will simply copy and paste your password, even though it is very complicated, and just actually gain access behind your back. And so choosing a complicated password that the user doesn't or isn't able to memorize may not always be the best way to go. The best way to go is to maybe to have actually a password that is difficult enough to guess, long enough, contains several combinations, yet it is still something that the user can memorize so that they are not tempted to write it down and introducing this vulnerability in the system. Okay. This is why most systems would have certain strategies for choosing a password. Length should be, for example, 10, 13 characters, different categories, and everything that we have discussed. So if you are designing an application where user authentication is required and you're doing user authentication using passwords, then obviously, just like any user authentication system, you have to store the credentials of the users in your database, in your backend. So how will the passwords be stored on your system? There are different ways, and they all have varying actually degree of security. Obviously, the least secure way is to just actually store the passwords as they are in plain text in your database. You may assume that your database is quite secure and no one can actually gain access to it. And you trust your system administrators, for example, even though they would have access to these passwords. And so you may do that. And obviously, this is the least secure way. Um, in this case, how will actually an attacker try to gain access to the system? An attack on the password is basically called a dictionary attack. Basically, the way the attacker executes this attack is that offline, the attacker would prepare a dictionary. And this dictionary would contain all possible combinations of well-known usernames, phone numbers, birth dates, and different permutations of all those things, different combinations. So the dictionary will be a quite huge document that contains a very large number of possible names and numbers that may be chosen as passwords. And then the attacker would try one of these one at a time. And if the systems don't have an upper limit as to how many failed password entry trials you may have, then the attack would eventually have a very high probability of succeeding. This is why systems, for example, would impose a certain limit on the trying a wrong password 3 times, for example. But many systems don't. And so if the system doesn't have such a restriction, then the attacker can try all the different combinations that he or she wants, and eventually they will have a high chance of succeeding. So if you store the password in plain text, as we said, this is the least secure way. Another way to store them is to hash them before you store them in the database. So you store the hashes rather than you store the passwords. So if you want to gain access to the database, you send actually the hash of the password and the database matches that. If the passwords are stored as hashes in your system, then what the attacker will do is that the attacker will take this dictionary and hash it before actually trying the different combinations. And so a hash dictionary is basically called a rainbow table. It's basically the hash of all the possible permutations that the attacker has prepared. So whether it's a dictionary, a plain dictionary attack, or a rainbow table, that depends on how the passwords are stored. So storing actually the hash of the password is, let's say, a medium security way. The most secure way, as it is widely recognized, is to store the the passwords in a salted way. Basically, at the time when the password is chosen, the password is hashed, and a random value that is called a salt is concatenated to it before the hashing. Okay, and so you store the salted hash of the password, and it looks something like that. Here in this table, you have the user ID and the hash of the password stored in the table. Here, you would have the user ID, you will have the salt, and you will have the hash of the concatenated salt and password in this case. And so why is this more secure? Because in this case, the attacker would not just have to actually try all different usernames, all different passwords in a dictionary, and try also their hashes or calculate their hashes. The attacker would have to try also a very large combination of salt values for every possible permutation. So now, all of a sudden, you have significantly increased the complexity of this attack by introducing this random value that is called a salt that is attached to each password, increasing dramatically the search space that the attacker would have to look into before actually finding the right combination of salt and password in this case. So these are examples of how they are stored. So clear text password is stored, for example, just as it is entered. The hash password would be entered as a value, whatever it is, and it's stored on the server as a hash. The salted password, you will generate the salt, and then you will hash the password and the salt to get something that you would actually store in the server in this case. Okay, that's the first method of authentication and the most widely used one. The next one that we will discuss is inherence-based, which is the area of biometrics, something that the user does or something that the user is. And there are many biometric features that have been used in literature. Some of them are shown in the slide: fingerprint, facial recognition, eye retina or iris scanning, hand geometry, written signature, voice print, which is not really a good idea because voice can be easily faked, keystroke dynamics. Some researchers also looked into persistent biometric user authentication, like something that you would do as you go by your daily activities, like walking, for example, or opening a cabinet, or doing something that you would normally do. And if you are able to extract certain features from that, then maybe you can do user authentication based on something like that. Okay, so in any biometric system, there are certain requirements and there are certain practical considerations. For the requirements, the feature that you choose for the user authentication should be universal. That means everyone should have it. For example, everyone has a fingerprint, everyone has facial features. And so you cannot actually choose something that only some people would have and others won't. Also, the features that you choose must be distinct. They must be different significantly or sufficiently from one person to the other. This is the case, for example, with fingerprints. No two people have the same fingerprint, for example, and they should not change with time. This is the requirement known as permanence. If you have a feature that changes with time, then even the legitimate system will not, the system will not recognize a legitimate user. And finally, it should be collectible, meaning that it shouldn't be something that the user is not comfortable allowing a system to actually measure. Okay. Then there are some practical considerations. Any biometric system has a certain accuracy, and so it must be actually tuned or configured to maximize this accuracy and maximize also the usability of the system. It must be fast enough to allow user authentication. People must actually be willing to accept it. Must be difficult to fool it. So, for example, false positives should be as low as possible, and it must be safe to use, meaning that the that you would present your credentials to the system must not actually present any danger to the user himself or herself. Okay, so just like any user authentication system, it starts with registration or enrollment, where you present your credentials to the system, and in this case, the system will extract your features. The figure that you see at the bottom of the slide, for example, is where a user presents their fingerprint, and then the system will extract something called the minutia points. And from the minutia points, which are specific points on your fingerprint, the system will build a minutia map and then convert this to a data stream, which is the one that is actually stored in the system. When you want to gain access, you would present your fingerprint again. The system will extract again the minutia points and create the map and compare the final data stream with the one that is stored. Interesting thing to mention is that matching in biometric authentication is never 100%. It is a value that the system just simply has to decide whether this value exceeds an acceptable threshold or not. And the threshold has to be defined in a way that considers the four parameters that you see in the slide: true positives, true negatives, false positives, false negatives. The true positives is when a legitimate user sample is accurately defined. That means the legitimate user is accepted. A true negative is when an attacker sample is actually rejected, which is the case that is desired. The false positive is when an attacker gains access to the system. So the system doesn't recognize that this is an attacker sample and thinks that this is a legitimate user and the attacker is accepted. And finally, the false negative is when a legitimate user doesn't get access. The system does not recognize their credentials. So from these values, we can compute two parameters, the FMR and the FNMR. The FMR is basically the number of matching attacker samples over the total number of attacker samples. That means the number of attacker samples that were actually accepted. Okay, so this is the number of false positives over the number of false positives plus the number of true negatives. That's the total number of attacker samples. The FNMR is the number of non-matching user samples over total number of user samples. The non-matching user samples are the false negatives over the total number of user samples, which is the false negatives plus the true positives. Okay, so you determine the threshold T such that you balance the FMR and the FNMR. And you want to achieve a threshold such that the FMR is actually equal to the FNMR. This is called the equal error rate parameter, and you want to have a low equal error rate in this case. Okay. Final type of user authentication that we will discuss, and we'll actually spend the rest of the lecture discussing it because it's one of the most widely used authentication methods in modern systems, which is the ownership-based authentication, or the authentication that is based on something that you have or something that you own. And here, something that you own doesn't actually have to be a physical item. It doesn't have to be, for example, an access card or a key. It can be, for example, a digital token, I mean, something that your system owns or your browser owns, or that your browser has obtained from the server. And this is then presented to the server to gain access later. And this is what we are going to focus on, authentication tokens. And there are two types, as you see in this figure. There are tokens that are used for non-persistent authentication, and there are tokens that are used for persistent authentication. Non-persistent authentication means that it's just one-time authentication. You just want to do something in the system now, and you need to be authenticated just for this activity, and that's it. And in this case, the non-persistent authentication can be based on synchronized methods or challenge response methods. And for persistent authentication, we will discuss several systems: cookies, JWT, OpenID, and Open Authentication 2.0. We start our discussion with non-persistent authentication. Sometimes they're also called one-time password. Okay, so many bank systems, for example, when you do your online banking, you can gain access to your online banking account by just entering your username and password. But then when you want to do any transaction inside the online banking system, there is an elevated authentication method. For example, many banks have something called a one-time password generator. And for example, the bank that I use has a separate application on your phone that you download on your phone. And what happens is when you want to do a transaction, you open your phone, you open this application, and you have to enter, for example, your PIN number, or you scan your fingerprint, or authenticate yourself to the phone in whatever way. And if this authentication is successful, then the application opens and it generates to you a number. This number is called the one-time password. You take this number and you enter it in the designated place in the online banking system. And if the number matches what the server expects, which should be the correct one that you generate on your phone, then the transaction will be allowed. So you're doing an elevated user authentication action. In addition to authenticating yourself to the online banking system, you're doing an elevated authentication by using your phone in addition to the credentials on the web portal itself. And so the discussion here will be, how do we guarantee that the number that you generate on your phone, which is generated locally, by the way, you don't have to have an internet connection to generate it. How is this number that you generate locally on your phone going to match the number that the server is going to expect? Which means that the application must actually have some kind of synchronization feature. And there are two general methods to ensure this synchronization. There are either clock-based tokens or counter-based tokens. In clock-based tokens, basically you have the application in your system. There is an algorithm that accepts the PIN number or whatever credentials are, could be the minutia map of the fingerprint, for example, and accepts also the value of the clock, and uses these two inputs to generate the token, and then sends the token to the host. The host will have the same information, will have the PIN registered by the user, saved in the system, as well as the clock. And these two things will be input to the same algorithm, which will generate a number, and the number will be compared to the one that is sent by the user. Now, if the clock on the user's phone is the same as the clock on the system, and the PIN is the same as the one that is stored in the system, then the algorithm will generate the same value and will be an accepted value from the system. The only problem here is clocks tend to drift. it is not very easy to actually have a clock that is fully synchronized with another system. And so it might actually not be very easy to implement at the end of the day, which is why many other systems use something called counter-based OTP. There is a counter that is running, and the counter as well as the password or the PIN number or whatever user credentials are together fed into the HMAC algorithm, and this generates the OTP, the one-time password. At the back end, there is also the same counter, which is synchronized initially with the one at the client and the secret, and it is they are fed into the same HMAC algorithm with the same key, okay, and generates a value that is compared that with the one that is sent by the user. If they match, then it is an accepted token. These two systems are widely used, and their advantage is they don't require the back end to be online at the time when the OTP is generated. So you can actually do them in two parallel systems as we discussed. You generate the OTP on your phone and you take the number and you enter it on the web portal. So they don't require communication between the entity that is actually generating the OTP and the back end. They just require that somehow the back end is provided with the value at the time of authenticating the user. Another method for non-persistent user authentication is using challenge response. But this actually requires an active exchange between the user and the host. Basically, when the user wants to be authenticated, they will ask the host for a challenge. The challenge is typically a random number that is generated just for the session, which is called a nonce. It is sent back to the user, and the user will generate a response that is based on this nonce and based also on the PIN number or password or whatever user credential that they have. And the response will be sent back to the server, and it should be the expected one at the server. If it is, then the user will be allowed access. For the rest of the lecture, we will now consider persistent user authentication. This is something that I'm sure we are all familiar with. For example, there are many applications on our phone that are always authenticated. For example, when you open your phone and you open your Facebook application, you are not required to enter your username and password every time. You are automatically authenticated. So there is persistent user authentication for this application on your phone. That means the back end always authenticates you. The idea here is that the back end or the Facebook server in this case considers your phone to be secure. Or more accurately, it considers that it is your responsibility to keep your phone secure. So they trust your phone and you trust your phone. Okay? So they send a token or they send something to your phone that your phone keeps, that your phone stores. Okay, and whenever you want to access the application, you just send this item or this token or whatever it is that the system has sent to you. You send it back to the server to tell the server that it is basically the phone, the secured phone that is actually sending this item. One example of such system is doing persistent authentication using cookies, which is called session-based authentication. Okay? Basically, initially, you authenticate yourself to the server using whatever method, a challenge response system, a username and password, biometrics, whatever. You just authenticate yourself to the server. Once you do that, the server will send you back a cookie. A cookie is basically just a session ID. It's a value that is sent from the server back to the client. And if this is based on HTTP, as cookies obviously are part of the HTTP protocol, then it is possible that you build this on top of TLS, which means that HTTPS will be used, which means that this value that is sent back from the server to the client will be encrypted. That means no one can actually see it. When this value is returned to the client will save it in their cookie file in the browser. Now, whenever the client wants to gain access to the server, whenever actually the client sends any HTTP request to the server, this is going to include a line that has the cookie ID. So every subsequent request that the client sends to the server will include the cookie ID, which contains the session ID that the server has sent to the client, telling basically the server that this is the legitimate client, and so the server can allow access to the client based on this cookie. Obviously, if your browser file deletes the cookie, then you have to enter your username and password again and obtain another cookie. But other than that, as long as you're logged in, you will have persistent user authentication until you log off the system. What are the advantages here? Just like the use of any other cookie, it turns your application to stateful. HTTP is stateless by nature, but cookies make it actually transform it into a stateful application. That means the server is going to remember certain things about you. The cookie itself is very small in size, so storing it is not a problem. Um, um, the cookies don't require any additional effort by the developer because the browser will actually automatically add it to every request. So the developer doesn't actually need to worry about storing the cookies locally or adding extra items to the code to store the cookies locally or send the cookie in every request. This is actually done automatically. Okay. Okay, but there are also some limitations. Cookies are vulnerable to something called the cross-site forgery attack, which we will discuss in a little bit. Also, the cookie system puts all the load on the server because the server generates the cookie and has to verify it in every request. Okay, so the load on the server, which serves many clients. Later in the lecture, we will see another system which puts more load on the client rather than the server. Another limitation is that the cookie needs to be sent in every request. There is no pick and choose in this case. So even if this request doesn't really need any authentication, for example, it's a request to download the logo of the web page. This is public information that doesn't really need authentication, but yet the cookie will actually be sent in every single request. So it's a little bit of overhead, wasted bandwidth that is induced in the system in this case. So the major problem with cookie or authentication or session-based authentication is the cross-site request forgery attack. For this attack to be possible, three conditions must be in place for the attacker. First of all, there must be an action in the system that the attacker would like to exploit. For example, it's a system that allows someone to send a financial transaction to someone else, send, for example, money or funds to someone else. Any kind of action that the attacker would like to exploit. Entering your username and password, for example, or modifying permissions. Any action that the attacker would have an incentive to exploit. That's the first condition. The second condition is that the authentication in the system must be based on cookies and cookies only. That means once a person or a user is logged in the system, all subsequent authentication is just based on cookies. Nothing else is actually, no other mechanism is in place for tracking sessions or validating user requests. And the final condition is there must be no unpredictable request parameters. That means there is no random numbers that are inserted in the request to prevent replay attacks or anything like that. If these three conditions hold, then an attacker should theoretically be able to execute a cross-site request forgery attack. And let's see an example. Let's say the attacker wants to trick the user into sending this URL, into generating this request. And the request basically is a GET request, which contains all the necessary information to transfer this amount of money to this account. And we assume that this account is owned by the attacker. So if the user sends this URL, they will transfer this money to Fred, the attacker, whoever the attacker is. Okay. Now, the trick is obviously the attacker wants the user to send this, but the user doesn't want. So the attacker should or would try to do this behind the user's back in this case. So how would the attacker do that? The cross-site request forgery attack works in this way. First of all, the victim must be logged in the system. So the victim logs in the system normally as they do, for example, because they want to make a transaction or whatever the case is. So they log in the system and they are now authenticated in the system. And if they are authenticated, then it means that the system has sent back to them a cookie ID, which is stored in the victim's browser. Okay, remember we are assuming that authentication is done only based on cookies in this case. Okay, now that means the victim, or the browser of the victim has now a cookie that the browser will automatically enter in every subsequent HTTP request that the victim makes. And the browser will do this automatically without the application needing to do anything on the victim's browser. At this point, the attacker would generate a malicious website and send a link to the victim that the victim would be um, motivated to access it. For example, it's something that the victim is interested in, or attractive news, something basically flashy that the victim would be tempted to click on. And this is the trick. It's an active attack. The victim actually has to do something in order for the hacker to gain access to the system. Once the victim clicks on this link, it's just an HTTP request. When you click on any link, you're actually sending an HTTP request to that destination. But the destination in this case is the website of the hacker. And the response to an HTTP request that the victim will send is an HTTP response. And therein lies the problem. Now the hacker has a way to send an HTTP response to the victim, and the hacker is in full control over what this HTTP response would contain. You see, without the victim clicking on the link, there would be no reason for the hacker to send an HTTP response to the victim. The victim's browser obviously will not accept it because it will be a response that is not generated for any request. Okay, so there must be a link that is clicked by the victim to send an HTTP request and trigger the response back from the hacker's website. The response would contain a script that generates an HTTP request to send basically this link. It can be something like that. A hidden, for example, URL inside an image file, inside a malicious script that would generate a GET request to send this URL. And because the user is already authenticated to the system, to the bank website, I mean, once the victim's browser generates this HTTP request that the hacker has tricked them to generate, it will automatically contain the legitimate cookie ID, which the bank website will verify it and allow the transfer in this case. This is why it must be required that the victim must already be logged in the system and must have obtained a cookie ID from the bank before any of this happens, so that when the attacker tricks the victim into clicking on that link and sending them the malicious script, once the browser generates the malicious HTTP request, the browser of the victim generates the malicious HTTP request behind the back of the victim, it will automatically include the session ID or the cookie ID of the bank as it would normally do. Okay, this example is using a GET request. There is another example here that uses also a POST request. Works in a very similar way, except that using the POST request is a little bit more complicated because it has to be something that the victim's browser would actually create and send to the back end in this case. Okay. So there is a way to prevent CSRF tokens, to prevent CSRF attacks, which is using CSRF tokens. The idea is to have something that is randomly generated just for these dangerous actions, for example, transferring funds or anything like that, and it is sent in a hidden form that the attacker would not see and would not be able to predict in this case. Okay, so this is for the cookie authentication. So we have seen that it is easy to use and is efficient except for the CSRF attacks. Another method for doing user authentication in a persistent way is used on a standard that is called the JSON Web Tokens. Some of you may be already familiar with it. JSON Web Tokens can be used for authentication. It can be used for many other applications. In this lecture, we will only discuss its use in authentication. And the reason JWT has found actually wide use in authentication is its standardized format. A JSON Web Token consists basically of three fields: the header, the payload, and an optional signature. That means the signature may not be there, maybe only two fields. The payload is basically the information that would be used for authentication. The username and password, for example, the access requirements or what the user is allowed access to, the permissions, for example, whatever it is. Now, how is this payload treated? That is specified in the header. For example, if there is a digital signature, which would be the third field, then the algorithm used to generate the digital signature will be specified in the header. The type of the JWT would also be specified in the header. For example, the header that you see here is or has a digital signature that is generated using the algorithm HS256, which we will discuss in a little bit. and the type of the JWT is a JWT token, and this is the signature here as generated by this algorithm. So the signature basically signs the payload and the header as well. Now, the JWT before the signature is generated is actually encoded, and it's encoded using something called the base 64 algorithm. Okay, now you have to note that once it's encoded, it looks like that. This is not hashing. Okay, it's encoding. There is a significant difference here. We said that hashing is non-reversible. Once you hash something, you cannot obtain it back, but encoding is. Okay, so it's encoded using a base 64 algorithm. It doesn't take any key or anything, so it's just a completely reversible encoding, just to present it in the way that you see here. And so typically when you see a coded JWT, you'll see it consisting of three fields, again separated by the period here. So the first field here is the header, the next one is the payload, and the one after that is the signature. The JWT itself can be plain text, can be encrypted, and the signature is optional as we said. Okay, and this figure here shows an example of the generation. So you take the header, which includes the algorithm, you convert it into base 64, you get a value. You take the payload, okay, you convert it using base 64, you get another value. You concatenate them as you see here. So this is the concatenation, and you feed the concatenation to the signature algorithm. If it exists, you generate the signature, you encode the signature, and you concatenate it with the two other fields, and this is the JWT. Many algorithms are used for the signature. The most widely used one is HS256, which is basically just HMAC using SHA-256. RSA is also supported. There is elliptic curve DSA. There is HMAC, but using SHA-384 and 512. So the default one uses SHA-256, but you have the option of using more secured hashing algorithms as well. Okay. Now, you may think HMAC uses a symmetric key. So how can an algorithm that uses a symmetric key be used in a digital signature? Well, so far our discussions have said that this is not possible because symmetric keys cannot actually be used in a digital signature. But in JWT, you can actually do it depending on how your system is designed. Consider, for example, this authentication mechanism that is based on the JWT. The figure on the left shows you the traditional cookie-based authentication, where you you authenticate yourself to the server, you get the cookie ID, and then you send it in every subsequent request. If you're doing authentication based on the JWT, then you start with the same authentication step. So you authenticate based on the username and password or whatever method, and then the server will send back to you a JWT token. Okay, and then you save your token locally. Every time you want to send a request that needs authentication, you will send along with it the token as well. And the server will then verify the token. Now note here that the server generates the token and sends it to you, and you will send back the token to the server whenever you want to gain access to that server after that. So the browser doesn't do anything to the token. The browser will just store the token and send it back later, which is why you can actually use HMAC in this case. If you're using HMAC as the signature algorithm, then the server is going to generate the key that will be used in the HMAC algorithm, will use it to generate the signature, and will send the token as it is to the browser. And then the browser, when it wants to gain access, it will send back the token as it is to the server, and the server will verify that it is the correct key that it has generated for this user. Thus, the key in this case, even though it's a symmetric key, it is known only to the server. No one else knows it. There is no key exchange. The server generates it, the server uses it, the server verifies the token in the end. Thus, this is why HMAC can actually be used as the signature algorithm in this case. And in fact, the server can just have one key for all the users, one key to generate actually all the tokens, because only the server knows it. So in this case, it can verify all the signatures in this case. Okay. The token can also be encrypted, so you can encrypt everything in it, and there are many algorithms that are supported. There are variants of AS, and you see, for example, it's AS 128 to 256, and there is the Galois counter mode that is also used. RSA is also supported. There are algorithms to exchange keys if this is necessary, if you want the browser actually to decrypt the token, but you may not. You might actually just send an encrypted token, the browser stores it, and send it back to the server whenever it wants. Okay? So what are the advantages of doing authentication based on JWT? It puts the load on the browser. So it's now up to the browser to store the token locally, and the server only validates. And now you don't have to send the token with every request. You only have to send the token with those requests that do require authentication, that do require that the server recognizes the client. But now the disadvantage is the load is also on the programmer. The programmer has to add to the code something that stores the tokens locally to process these tokens and send them to the server. So there is an additional effort by the programmer or the developer here as well. Okay. The JWTs are vulnerable to certain attacks. There is a common attack that is known as signature stripping. And this is done because the different parts of the JWT are encoded separately. For example, this would be a token which is signed. So there is a signature attached here. And the type of signature is specified in the header, okay, the algorithm that generated the signature. But what if the attacker takes the signature, throws it away, okay, and then changes the header to something that specifies that the token is not encrypted, or the token is not signed at all, to say instead of HS256 to say none. Okay, meaning that there will be no signature. As we said, the signature is optional. Okay, so what if the attacker does that, throws the signature away, and says that there is no verification, no signature at all, and sends the remaining part to the user in this case. And then if they do that, then they can change whatever they want in the payload. They can change the username and password, for example, and do something that that would allow them, for example, elevated access to the system or something like that. Okay. This would be this attack would succeed if the system is configured to accept non-signed tokens. So the treatment or the cure for that is to enforce the backend to not accept unsigned tokens, to only accept a token that has a signature that can be validated in this case. In another attack, some actually systems would send the JWT as a cookie. So rather than send you a session ID, rather than send you a cookie ID, they will send you a token, and your browser will store the token and send it in every subsequent HTTP request. If JWTs are stored as cookies, okay, then they are now vulnerable to the same attack that cookies are vulnerable to, which is the cross-site request forgery attack. Okay. Another attack is called cross-site scripting, which is an attempt to inject a malicious JavaScript into a trusted site. Basically, this JavaScript can steal JWTs or tokens from a local storage. And again, it will rely on backends that do not validate the data that is sent to it. Okay. Now, we have seen one method of straightforward authentication just actually based on the JWT structure. And the reason for that, as we said, is that it's the standardized format that many backends can automatically accept it and use it. One such standard that is based on the JWT largely is called the OpenID Connect, which is a way to have a standardized authentication method across different systems that are not related to each other. Okay, so if you use a standard like JWT, then they can all actually understand it. Another standard that uses JWT frequently, even though JWT is not specified in it, is called the Open Authentication 2.0. Okay, and it's a very widely used authentication framework. Okay, that we use it all the time without knowing. The definition here is from the RFC. It says that Open Authentication 2.0 or authorization framework enables a third-party application to obtain limited access to an HTTP service, either on behalf of a resource owner by orchestrating an approval interaction between the resource owner and the HTTP service, or by allowing the third-party application to obtain access on its own behalf. The key word here is that It enables a third-party application to obtain limited access onto an HTTP service on behalf of a resource owner. Whenever you go and try to gain access to an application and it asks you, for example, if you want to sign in using Google or using Facebook, this is what you're using. Okay? If you have an application, just a normal application that does whatever, and this application doesn't have its own user authentication system, it can actually rely on Google or Facebook to authenticate you. And they might actually not need Google or Facebook in anything, or they might actually be posting ads there or something like that. But at least they would be relying on Google or Facebook to authenticate you. And in this case, Google or Facebook will just tell this application that this is a legitimate user, that we recognize this user. Okay. And then if this application trusts Google or Facebook, then they would allow this user access in this case. Okay. Right. So Open Authentication 2.0 is an open authorization protocol. It enables apps to exchange credentials for trusted sites. A little bit of history. The motivation for that came around in the mid 2000s with the explosion of the mobile phones and mobile phone apps. Okay, and as the number of applications started to increase, these applications started to want to talk to each other, and so there was no standard way for them to exchange security credentials. So they started to invent some proprietary solutions such that they start to talk to each other. But as the number of applications grew, this became more and more challenging, and there came the Open Authentication 1.0. The purpose was to allow these applications to be able to exchange credentials, but it has um, uh, strict drawbacks. For example, it was used in many off-label use cases. That means it was not used for its intended purposes. And there was actually a way to use it without there being a user in the loop, which means that the applications can give access to each other without the user actually knowing that this is happening in the background. And therefore, to overcome these problems, Open Authorization 2.0 was proposed. And it is necessary to know what Open Authorization 2.0 is and what it is not. What it is not is that it's not defined outside of HTTP. That means it only works on top of HTTP and relies on TLS for securing the messages. That means itself is not encrypting anything. Open Authentication 2.0 is not an authentication protocol. It's not a protocol. It's rather a framework. Okay, it's a framework that allows a client authentication to token endpoint and resource owner authentication at authorization endpoint, as we will see. It's not a protocol that communicates anything about the user. And it's not a user-to-user delegation model. That means you only delegate access to an application. You cannot delegate access to another user. Okay, you delegate to software only. It's not an authorization model. Processing of the authorization information is up to the resource server. That means it doesn't tell the entities how to process the authorization information. This is up to them. It doesn't include a standardized token format, even though it is largely based on JWT. And it doesn't specify cryptographic methods. It rather just suggests what should be done. Okay. Now, to understand how it works, we first understand what are the parties involved. First of all, there is the resource owner. This is you in this case, someone who owns certain credentials, someone who has access to some resources or API. Okay, and there is the protected resource. The protected resource is the one that stores things on behalf of the resource owner. Okay, so as you see here, there is the protected resource that stores things on behalf of the resource owner. Then there is the client application, and the client application wants to access this protected resource. It wants to gain access to the protected resource that belongs to a different system completely, and it wants the resource owner to be able to provide them with access to this protected resource. Then there is the authorization server that will actually allow these parties to gain the necessary access in this case. So our goal, give the client, or more accurately, the client application, access to the protected resource on behalf of the resource owner. Okay, again, the goal is give the client access to the protected resource on behalf of the resource owner. Okay. There has been old solutions that did not really work for that. One solution would be to steal the key from the resource owner and actually gain access to the protected resource. Obviously a bad idea. Another idea is to use a universal key. All systems have the same credentials. Again, this is not very easy to do, especially across a very wide range of systems. Ask for the keys, but this means that you will be introducing an additional protocol that all the systems must actually recognize, or use service-specific credentials that can be used just to access this protected resource. Okay. Now, to see how Open Authorization 2.0 works, we will consider this example. We assume that there is a client, there is a person, a resource owner, who has two accounts, one on Facebook and one on Twitter. Okay. And what the resource owner wants is that they want that when they post a tweet on Twitter, that the tweet automatically appears on Facebook. I'm not a Twitter user, so I don't really know whether this is even possible or not, but this is the example in this scenario. So basically, you want when the user tweets something, it appears on their Facebook profile, which means that you want Twitter to be able to post something on Facebook on behalf of the resource owner. The resource owner will just actually post to Twitter. But then the resource owner wants Twitter to be able to gain access to Facebook and post the tweet or post this post on Facebook as well. So what will happen is, this is the resource owner who owns the Facebook page and drives the delegated authorization process. The Twitter application is now the client. This is the client application, which will be granted permission to post on Facebook. And now Facebook is the authorization server and the resource server. Facebook is the one that stores the protected resource, the the resource owner credentials that Twitter will be given access to. And Facebook will also be the authorization server that would allow Twitter this access using a token. So how will it work? First of all, the resource owner will go to Twitter and say, connect to my Facebook account. And then Twitter will redirect the resource owner to Facebook. And there, Facebook will prompt actually the resource owner to enter their credentials, their username and password, and then to give explicit permission to Twitter to access their Facebook feed. Okay. Once the user enters the correct credentials and provides the necessary approvals, the authorization server on Facebook will send back a token to the resource owner, and the token will be forwarded to Twitter. This token is typically based on JWT. So the authorization server sends the token to the resource owner, who forwards it to the client application, which is Twitter in this case. After that, when the resource owner wants to post something on Twitter and Facebook, they will just actually send it to Twitter, and Twitter will send this item, okay, which is an image of a cat in this case, send this item along with the access token that the resource owner has sent to them, send it to the Facebook server, and the Facebook server will validate the token and allow Twitter to actually post this item on Facebook. Remember here that Facebook sends this token to the resource owner, and the resource owner forwards it to Twitter. So initially, there is no communication between Facebook and Twitter. This is necessary to ensure the privacy of the resource owner, to make sure that the resource owner wants that, to make sure that Twitter and Facebook are not communicating behind the back of the resource owner. It has to be through the through the resource owner himself or herself. Okay. This token that Facebook will send to the resource owner, which will be forwarded to Twitter, doesn't have an indefinite lifetime. It will expire, and in this case, the Twitter application may send asking for something called a refresh token from Facebook. Facebook will send back the refresh token to Twitter, and this is done without the resource owner intervening at all. That means once the resource owner gives Twitter access to their Facebook profile, this access will be there forever. Okay, unless the resource owner goes to the Facebook server, the authorization server, and revokes this access after a while. Okay, that's it. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.